Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus coming at you with a quick mulligan guide for Boros Burn in the modern format. As a friendly reminder, if you do want to see the most informative modern videos on YouTube, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, and leaving a constructive comment down below. Let's get into the video. Alright, before we get started on taking a look at an example of sample hands that we would keep, we're going to do a quick look at the deck we're going to be working with. This is a traditional Boros Burn lake. None of the DRC or Ragavan things going on, no Mishra's Baubles. We're playing 20 lands, as I generally prefer that over the 19 lands with the one of random flex spot. Some people play Thunderous Wrath or other cards such as that in that spot. We're mainly playing the traditional things. Goblin Guide, Monastery Swiftspear, and Eidolon, along with Lava Spike, Lightning Bolt, and Boros Charm. And then most lists are playing some number of Helix, some number of Skullcrack, some number of Searing Blaze, Riftbolt, and Skewer the Critics, kind of giving you a nice mana curve. A lot of the times these 8 particular spells are copies, or 1 mana spells depending on situations. Obviously Riftbolt if you suspend it, Skewer the Critics if you can trigger Spectacle. It's pretty much the list we're working with. 3 mountains, 2 fetchable dual lands, 4 copies of Inspiring Advantage, and 5 of the Canopy lands. It's kind of the configuration I've liked as far as the mana base and such. That said, sideboard isn't particularly relevant as we're only going to be looking at Game 1 hands. So that said, let's get into some hands and see whether they would be keepable or not. Alright, right off the bat, we're taking a look at kind of an interesting borderline hand. Most lands with 4 lands you just simply can't keep. The only reason you would consider this one is if you're against a Thoughtseize or Inquisition deck. You might consider keeping this hand, especially on the play. You do have three Canopy lands to do that, but beyond that, you're just don't have enough spells, and you only have 1 creature, so you only have 6 points of burn, 1 Goblin Guide. Generally, your range of keepable hands is between 2 and 3 lands, and while a creature is a nice upside and these Canopy lands are nice, you do have a lot of error and potential flaws for this draw. Let's take a look at a potential mulligan to 6, see what we'd do out with that. This hand's much better. Obviously, you have the 4 spells here equals up to 10 points of burn plus a creature. I would honestly probably put back one of the fetch lands, and then this hand would be obviously a keep on the play or the draw. Alright, this is a great example of a very middling burn hand. We don't have any creatures to supplement our burn spells. This is a very much a how will this burn hand play out. And this hand has 15 points of burn potentially. You do have to be careful how you divide your burn spells between your opponent's creatures and your opponent's face in this particular build. Or not particular build, this particular hand with no Goblin Guides or Swiftspears or Eidolons. But overall, I think it's a very serviceable hand with 2 lands. Definitely in the range of keepable whether you're on the play or on the draw. You have some early interaction with creatures if necessary, a little bit of life gain. And if your opponent's playing a more controlling or a life gain strategy, you have a couple copies of Skullcrack, the one weakness to this version being it will run out of resources quite quickly as it doesn't have any repetitive sources of damage, no creatures or any of that kind of stuff. Alright, this is an almost ideal burn hand. Ideally, you'd like maybe 1 more 1-drop creature, 1 more 1-drop spell, but 3 lands, 2 creatures, couple of burn spells. Obviously, the one danger of this hand is that Searing Blaze is kind of a dead card, but even most of the control decks these days are playing some amount of creatures, even if it's just something like Solitude. So overall, very powerful hand. You have a redraw with the Sunbaked Canyon, so even if you start to flood out a little bit or run out of gas pretty quickly, you have a way to refill a little bit, and then obviously having access to Lurrus. Not the most terrible spot where your creatures could get dealt with quite quickly in the format, but overall, very solid keep whether you would be on the play or on the draw. Another example of a very solid hand. You have Swiftspear and the Eidolon backed up by a bunch of spells. One downside with this particular hand is you're a little light on creature interaction. Obviously Lava Spikes could only go to the face. Skewer the Critics requires you to be able to trigger Spectacle for it to be reasonable in the first couple of turns. That said, overall you do have a couple repeatable sources of damage, 9 points of burn. So overall this is a very easy keep on both the play and the draw. Although once again you do have to be mindful of how you sequence your spells and how much damage you take potentially with Eidolon and both your shock lands being in your opening hand. Alright, this is one of the hands that I've been looking for, kind of a borderline 1-land hand. I don't think this hand is keepable on the play or on the draw, quite frankly. You have no real upside to this hand with only 1 land. Normally when you're looking at a 1-land hand potential keepability, you're considering is there any 1-drop creatures and what is the upside if you don't draw a second land. This hand does have some of what I would look at to keep a 1-lander, which is 3 1-mana spells potentially. But the downside is you have these 3 clunky spells on the back end with only 1 land, and you would struggle to empty this hand fairly quickly, even if you did draw a second land, on your second or third turn. You could potentially consider keeping this hand on the play, but on the draw, this hand is you could, on the draw, you could definitely consider keeping this hand, but on the play, I would definitely say this is a mulligan. As far as a mulligan down to this. Another one-lander, which is actually quite interesting. If you were on a 6-card hand, would you consider keeping this hand? You have these as potential one-drop plays. Obviously a little bit risky. Air Skewer the Critics may or may not be turned on with Spectacle, so you really only have these 2 spells, but still, if you're already on 6 on the play, I would keep this hand. On the draw, I might consider going down to 5. But definitely an interesting back-to-back one-landers, but both are borderline, but I would definitely lean towards, mulliganing on 7, maybe keeping this one on 6, and pitching either the Searing Blaze or the Boros Charm, considering what, using whatever context clues you might have. If you happen to know their companion or stuff, you might be able to do context of what's more likely to be important, dealing with a creature or dealing 4 damage to your opponent's face. Alright, another good example of looking at a one-land hand. This hand has a little bit more upside. Basically, all of your spells, except for Skewer the Critics, are fairly quick. Can be cast on with 1 land. This is a hand you could certainly consider keeping. Most people would advise to mulligan this hand on the play and to keep it on the draw potentially. I would lean towards keeping it just because you're able to, play a spell every turn, and then overall 15 points of damage in your hand plus a Goblin God. So this is a hand that I would lean towards keeping both on the play and the draw, although you could certainly not fault you for being a little bit more disciplined in keeping this or mulliganing this hand on the play or the draw, just because it does have such high variance potentially to it. But generally, when I'm looking at one-land hands, I see what the context of the hand is. Do I have a couple of one-drop creatures? Do I have a one-drop creature and some reliably castable spells? This has basically 5 of your 20 guaranteed one-drop spells, your 16 one-drop spells plus 4 Rift Bolts, and then it does have a copy of Skewer the Critics. So, all that said, I do think this is a hand you could keep, but also a hand you can do, if you're a little bit more disciplined player, you could consider mulliganing, so overall, very solid hand. That said, give you some good examples of some hands, and now I'm just going to go ahead and talk about some general rules about hands you would keep and hands you would mulligan overall. Alright, overall, when you're looking at burn hands, the ideal hand is between 2 and 3 lands. And then you would like to see a one-drop creature or potentially an Eidolon in your hand. One-drop creatures tend to have your highest ceiling as far as quick kills and repetitive sources of damage. As far as other hands, anything beyond 3 lands, so 4 lands, you're mostly going to mulligan almost every single one of those. Even if you have a Canopy land or 2, it's just too risky that you're going to flood out and lose resources. Where things get a little more contentious is the one-landers, especially on 7. Like I said, there's a range of one-landers I will keep, especially skewing more towards the draw, where there's a one-drop creature and a couple other one-drop spells in your hand. A lot of other people can potentially lay that hand down as a little bit more of a discipline of a mulliganer. I don't tend to like his mulligan as much because Burn is very much a resource-dependent deck. They're a quantity deck, not necessarily a quality deck. Requires a certain number of quantity of resources to get your opponent from 20 to 0. While some decks will do some amount of damage themselves, there are decks out there like Tron, some of the affinity builds, and some of the other decks that aren't going to deal themselves any damage whatsoever, Amulet Titan being another one. You have to be very mindful of your resource management as far as how much things are on damage. As far as when you mulligan, you got to be a little bit more open with keeping one land in your hands. One thing for sure, as you go down to 6 and 5, you definitely don't want to keep the 4 land hands, or if you do keep, say you have 3 spells, 4 lands, obviously you only keep 2 lands. So as you go down in number, you have to be a little bit more selective, keeping in mind that you are a critical mass deck rather than a plus B combo deck or something that can maybe get away a little bit more with mulliganing down. A deck like Tron, once it gets a way to assemble Tron, it can draw any payoff in its deck and it's fine. Whereas a deck like Burn, would really struggle if it's only operating on 4 cards a large amount of time. So you got to be a little bit more lenient with your hands as you're going down the mulligans, especially once you're at 6. You got to be very careful that you're not going to run out of resources before killing your opponent. So you might have to keep a little bit looser of a hand on 6 or 5. A hand with maybe a little more upside, a little bit more variance in it. So overall, those are my thoughts on how to mulligan with Boros Burn in Modern. As a friendly reminder, if you do like this kind of content, please consider subscribing to the channel, giving us a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below, and I will hope to see you for the next video.